welcome all of you here this morning on behalf of the Canadian Marketing Association and our partner, the Accessibility Directorate of Ontario. My name's Wally Hill. I lead the Government and Consumer Affairs group at the Canadian Marketing Association. And we've got a great turnout here today for what is a very important subject and a good opportunity to learn about it. CMA is partnering with Ontario over the coming year to help build awareness about the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, to basically help educate organizations and marketers about the requirements of the law and how they can go about meeting those requirements. We've got, or we're expecting, I'm not sure that they're all here just yet. There's lots of traffic out there, as we all know. We're expecting some of our partners from the Accessibility Directorate to join us this morning, Bonnie Yu and Suzanne King and Jordy Gibbons. So hopefully they'll be here. They're up there on the right at the back, Suzanne and Jordy. So they'll be with us here this morning, and you know, at the end, if you've got some questions, I think they'll be around and able to answer further questions and talk about the resources that their organization has. But today, our feature is a panel of, an excellent panel of experts. They're all members of CMA's advisory panel on accessibility, and they'll be introduced in more detail in a few moments. But I'm just going to get us going by introducing our panel moderator. Aidan Tierney is the Senior Accessibility Consultant with IBM Interactive Experience. Aidan specializes in working with enterprises as they build processes to address web and mobile content accessibility. His work involves advising customers on accessibility strategy, conducting assessments and audits, training developers and testers, as well as fixing code. The technical solutions Aidan proposes rest on a foundation of 14 years experience as a front-end developer. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aidan, and he's going to lead us through the morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Wally. Good morning, everyone. So as Wally said, there's three excellent speakers, and I think I don't want to get in the way of starting with that. I'd like to first introduce David Berman. David Berman has 30 years of experience in design and communications and has worked extensively in the adaptation of printed materials for electronic distribution, including accessible web and PDF, and as well as that, software interface development. David is a fellow of the Society of Graphic Designers and as an expert speaker, author, designer, communications strategist, and consultant, David's professional work has taken him to over 50 countries. His most recent book is Do Good Design, published by Pearson. In 2012, David was appointed chair of Carleton Access Network, a committee on accessible information technology at Carleton's Reed Education, Accessibility, and Design Initiative. David serves as an advisor to the United Nations on how accessible web design thinking can help fulfill the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. Please give a warm welcome to David Berman.
Thank you so much. You know, before we begin, I want to remind ourselves that this gathering is taking place on the traditional land of the Iroquois people. And you know, we tend to think when we talk about accessibility, it almost goes without saying that we're talking about accessibility for people with disabilities. And yet, for a good part of the world, accessibility to the internet is just a matter of having the internet. You know, we live in a time where only 31% of humanity has access to the internet. And yet this is the decade where that changes. By the end of this decade, the majority of humanity will be online. And if you think about all the amazing things we've achieved in just the past 7 years, 7 years ago there was no YouTube, there was no Twitter, there was no LinkedIn, and yet if 30% of humanity has been able to create so much wonder online. Imagine what happens when we unleash the creativity, the marketing savvy, the intuition of all of humanity online. And yet right here in our own country, we don't have access for everyone yet. And so that's something we really have to work on as well. Now, I was just recently traveling in Norway, because we talk about Ontario leading the world at accessibility. And I was in Norway, and in fact, Norway has now come up with accessibility legislation that even trumps Ontario's. And now their deadlines aren't as tight as ours. And Brittany's going to tell us all about the deadlines for AODA a little later. But what I wanted to do is just put us in the perspective that here we are in this 10,000th generation of humanity. There's been 10,000 generations of we humans, depending on your spiritual background, and we happen to be living in the first generation where it's possible to include everyone. And I find that not just remarkable, but I feel it's incumbent upon us then to take as much advantage as we can. Bruce Mao, another designer from right here in Toronto, asked us this question: now that we can do anything, what will we choose to do? And indeed, in living in this time, living in this place, right here in Ontario, right here in Canada, we are leaders when it comes to accessibility. I was asked to do to work with the World Wide Web Foundation, something called the Web Index. Have you heard of it, the Web Index? It's like an annual benchmark of how we're doing internationally. And Canada, year after year, we benchmarked Canada against over 50 countries in terms of accessibility, as well as other aspects. And year after year, Canada's up there. But as well, here in Ontario, if you do a Google Trend search on the term web accessibility, you find that Ottawa, where I'm from, which is because our federal government was the first in the world to go deep with web accessibility, and Toronto, both Ottawa and Toronto, are in the top 8 cities globally. So we here in Ontario are ground zero for accessibility. Now, of course, why? I mean, we Canadians, we're kind of famous for exporting good governance. We're really good at showing the world how we can create a civilization where no one gets left behind. And so we tend to think of the reason for embracing accessibility is just simply the right thing to do. But in fact, I've found there's 5 reasons to really focus on accessibility, good business reasons. And the first one is there's just so many of us. So there's so many people to reach, and we don't want to leave anyone behind. So for instance, if we think, how many people do you figure have a substantial disability? What percentage do you figure? Anyone? George, what do you think?
Oh, no, I was just raising my hand.
Oh, you just like raising your hand. How many people enjoy raising their hands like George? No one. What do you figure? How many people have a substantial disability?
8%.
8%? Okay, so let's see, how many humans are we having in Ontario these days? 10 million? How many in Canada? All right, so if we take 8%, how many people are we talking about? 2.4 million people? We wouldn't want to leave 2.4. Actually, I'm kind of skeptical about this 8% thing. You want to do it was do a little experiment, if you don't mind. Make yourselves a little vulnerable on a Wednesday morning. I want to try something. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. But I think you'll enjoy it. It'll take us about 4 minutes. I'm going to list a bunch of disabilities. I want to get a sense of what percent of us right here in this room have some sort of substantial disability. I'm going to list a bunch of things. And then when I'm done the list, I'm going to ask you to stand up if you have any of these things. So we won't know what you have. Okay? And I have 2.5 of these things, by the way. Maybe in the next 20 minutes, you're going to figure out what I've got. So here's my list. Do you have trouble with your vision? Do you wear glasses? Have you had laser eye surgery? Are you blind? Do you not see certain colors? Do you have trouble reading that wording in the bottom left corner of the screen from the back of the theater? Do you have a challenge with your hearing? Do you not hear certain frequencies? Do you have a problem? Do you have any pain when you move your limbs? Have you ever had your arm in a cast for more than 3 days? Do you have a learning challenge? Do you have a ADHD? Are you already bored with my list? Are you pregnant? Are you drunk? Are you stoned? There's more things I could list. Are you in a wheelchair? Anything like this. Okay, there's more. Just stand up, please, if you have at least one of these things. Let's just see how many people we are. Let's take a look around here. What do you think, 8%? Let's just take a look. Hey, look, I appreciate this. Look around you. I think we're talking about 90%. I want you to look around. I want you to think when you're marketing, when you're thinking about marketing to people and marketing to people with disabilities, these are the people you're marketing to. Look left, look right. These well-dressed, humorous, styling people are the people we're appealing to when we create accessible websites, accessible documents. Thank you for standing up. So maybe 80, 90%. So why would we want to leave all those people out of our reach? Now, the second reason is search engine optimization. When we create documents that are accessible, Google, the Google Spider, the Google search engine has the cognitive ability of perhaps a 3.5-year-old. And if we want Google to give us high results as well as accurate results, we're going to get better search results if we structure our websites according to these rules of accessibility, which Brittany and George are going to go deeper with. The third reason is it's good HR. If we want to attract and retain the best people, would we want to leave behind potentially 90% or even 8% of the candidates? No, we want the best people working in our organizations. And of course, if we use our websites and our documents day to day, then of course we can't include everyone unless everyone can access them in terms of helping develop them and access them. The fourth reason, it's just the right thing to do. We're proud to not leave anyone behind. But it's this fifth reason, this AODA, that kind of brings us together today. And Brittany will be going into the details of it. But the thing that compels us here in Ontario is that we happen to live in a province that decided to take the most courageous, most far-reaching approach to online accessibility, as well as accessibility in the physical space in the history of civilization. And that's pretty awesome. That's something to be quite proud of. Now, I just chose a random website just to see what's probably. We were thinking our organization perhaps should join the CMA, and so I thought, okay, how do you join the CMA? Well, there's the membership link up there. So I thought, okay, I'll go to the membership link. The thing is, I don't see color very well, so I'm going to show you what the CMA website looks like if you take all the color out of it. 10% of the men in Ontario can't see color. So you want to join the CMA, you want the membership link. Where's that? Okay, it's over here. So I finally figured out, I chose the membership link, and then I got to this page. And I get there also, if I say join CMA, I also get to the same link. But I started looking down the page, and I'm thinking, where do you go to actually join? So here's the actual site. So I'm looking where to join. Where do you join? Where do you join? Where do you join? Where do you join? I think it's a marketing organization. They're probably really good at making sure I join, making sure my organization joins. And I couldn't find it. Now, you folk who are really good at seeing red probably know that this thing is here. But you see, when I don't see that, and there's no underline there to give me a cue, I just see that's part of a paragraph when determining your decision to join CMA. So we tend to think of web accessibility in the terms of extremes. We tend to think of someone who's never seen in their lives, someone who can't hear at all, someone who's in a wheelchair, someone who's a quadriplegic, and yet the vast majority of disabilities are far more subtle, and they affect us each day. So when we're talking about opportunities for marketing, and we realize that something as simple as just changing the color of this phrase means 10% more people can join our organization, it's really good news. Because if we can make small adjustments like this and increase our reach, why wouldn't we? And indeed we can. And indeed most of the things we need to do are fairly subtle. So here in Ontario, we are moving forward with our deadlines. And yet there's other people come along for the ride. So Manitoba, for instance, has just passed legislation. They haven't set their deadlines yet, but they've got legislation. BC is working on legislation. Nova Scotia is working on legislation. And yet here in Ontario, we have the opportunity to show everyone how it's done. And not just in Canada, but globally. I think this is an opportunity for marketing professionals in Ontario to lead the world. We're already finding we have people from around the continent and from Europe, from Asia, from Australia contacting us because they realize that here in Ontario, we know how to get this done. We're years ahead of them. And as different parts of the world come online, these dates are very valuable to us. But the history of designing for accessibility actually goes back quite a distance. If I take you back to 1876, this guy, You know this guy? You recognize this guy? This guy with the furry beard? We love to claim he's a Canadian. Yep, that's right, Bell. Yeah, Alexander Graham Bell. And he wasn't trying to invent the telephone. He was just trying to create a better way for teachers in a school for the deaf in Massachusetts to be able to do their jobs better. On the way, he ends up inventing the telephone, the transducer, the amplifier, the loudspeaker. He invents all these things, but he was trying to design for the extremes. And time again, if we find that when we accommodate the extremes, when we try to delight people with extreme needs, everyone benefits, assuming we know why we're doing it. Now, meanwhile, Bell dies, but he leaves behind Bell Labs, this amazing company that goes on to keep creating amazing stuff, like hearing aids. Because why wouldn't everyone with a hearing challenge want to hear? But back in the 30s, a hearing aid was it was something that was heavy and big, and it said, I don't hear so well, this thing you had to wear around your neck. So they wanted to design a better hearing aid, and after the Second World War, physicists at Bell Labs figured out how to create this amazing device, the transistor. Now, they invented the transistor because they wanted to create something smaller, something tiny that could fit in your ear, that didn't take much battery, that had a great signal-to-noise ratio. And they invented the transistor, they created a better hearing aid, and they went home for dinner. They didn't even think that transistor could help revolutionize civilization. But then this guy, Akio Morita from post-war Tokyo, says, wait a minute, if people who don't hear so well enjoy having something they can walk around with that can help them hear, maybe everyone wants to be able to walk around with something. He invents the transistor radio. In order to do so, he buys the worldwide rights to the transistor for $25,000. His family thinks he's crazy. $25,000? What have you done? But of course, there's transistors now. Well, they're in all our laptops and our projectors and all this amazing equipment. We won't leave home without 1 million transistors in our pocket. Transistors get us to the moon and back. But it all starts with designing for extremes. Now, here in Toronto, typical traffic signal with the typical, on the left, I got the green for go and the red for stop. Now, if I just press my button here, I disappear all the color. So this is what someone with a full color deficit experiences when they approach a traffic signal at night. And you know what the largest source of accidental death is in Ontario? It's traffic accidents, especially those that take place at these signals, because we're relying only on color in our design, which is a mistake. Now, in Quebec, I'm from Ontario, I'm from Ottawa, and we're on the edge of Quebec, and we just cross over the river. Most of the traffic signals in Quebec look like this. Not just relying on color, but also relying on the number of lamps and the shape of the lamps. So we're still using color, red, green. The legacy users get it. You drive to Quebec, you say, you're not confused, I get it. But everyone enjoys these more because we're not relying just on one color. And, as we work with, now a more extreme case of this, I blogged about this recently, we want to read deeply about it, but basically the idea is this: I was in Massachusetts, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I found they have these lamps downtown if you want to turn left. So what is that lamp supposed to say? What does it mean?
It says no turn on red. But
It says don't turn on red, but if you can't see color, what's it saying to you? It says kill yourself as quickly as you can. We don't have to worry about people with color deficits anymore. And it amazes me that that's legal in America. The good news is that it's never been easier to get our heads around this. It's never been easier to make things accessible. It's the perfect time. So if you don't know a lot about this, do not be concerned, because it's never been easier to make a world that's more accessible, and it's never been easier the world's never been more open to the idea. Things are changing very rapidly. It's like where we were with recycling 10 years ago. Can you imagine there'd be recycle bins in every theater in Toronto? 10 years ago, you'd say, you're a crazy left-wing environmentalist to say that. Now, it goes without saying, well, it's the same with accessibility. It's coming very quickly, but important, if we're going to do it, we have to understand that, we have to understand the disabilities we're challenged with. We have to see what we're dealing with. And so, whether we're dealing with permanent disabilities or temporary ones, we can think about web accessibility in terms of the temporary or permanent loss of unavailability of certain human senses. So the one we tend to focus on most is the visual, because it makes sense. The largest bandwidth pipe into the human brain is typically the eye. So it makes sense we're sending in a lot that way. But then we have all sorts of technologies that can overcome the situation if there's a visual challenge. The second most thing that comes up most often in web accessibility is dexterity or mobility challenges. We also have hearing challenges, language challenges, speech challenges, cognitive and learning disabilities, which actually are the most subtle and most pervasive. The work we did, Aidan was mentioning, I do work at Carleton University, and 80% of the students we're working with at Carleton University or challenged with a disability are cognitive challenges, even more difficult, more so, and sometimes they don't even realize what they have, and it's certainly not apparent when you meet someone. I mean, if I meet someone and they've got a white cane or a service dog, it's pretty apparent they have a visual challenge. But for cognitive disability, it's not usually that obvious, and so this can be the most challenging. What we've done in this remarkable generation, in the last 30 years, more people have been liberated by assistive technologies than all the wars and revolutions in human history. It's a remarkable time to be alive. We humans keep inventing ideas, and basically what we do is, if there's a certain disability present, either permanently or temporarily, we either swap in another human sense or we magnify one that's already available. So for instance, if I don't read small things, we make things larger, and we all enjoy touch and zoom interfaces. If you can't see so well, this is the eSight, invented right here in Ontario, takes the images coming in and reprocesses them so someone with to see things differently can see them more the way that most people see things. Nose technology, which follows your nose and you blink instead of you blink your eyes instead of clicking a mouse, allows someone who has no use of their arms, or whether it's temporary or they're just busy driving or something, to be able to navigate. And now the tablets and other mobile devices have become so ubiquitous, it means that we can mash things up using products that are now mainstream. So when I look on television, I see Apple's #1 reason for me to buy the latest iPhone has to do with voice recognition. And yet this is technology that was based on technology developed 25 years ago for people with extreme challenges. If you have this girl is wearing a technology called a SIP-Puff device that if you're quadriplegic, if you have no use of your limbs below your neck, then this SIP-Puff device allows you to moving your head is like moving a mouse. And sipping or puffing on the tube is like left-clicking or right-clicking the mouse. If you can't see, we can use the ability to feel. I've given you each one of these little next cards from us, an example of Braille. And though we tend to think of Braille as a physical manifestation online, we have Braille displays. So for instance, this device, I can pass it around if you want to examine it and try to guess what it is. But basically, this smartphone for people who can't see includes a Braille display of the same Braille pins that pop up. And you can just pass it around and see if you find that interesting. So we can use Braille in the electronic world as well as announcing information in order to make things possible. And now announcing information, whether you can't read because you don't know how to read or because you can't read because you can't see the words, screen readers are probably the most ubiquitous assistive technology we tend to work with and therefore try to accommodate. And of course, we're now all enjoying this. So when we're driving down the road or whatever, we're in the theater where we need the experience of hearing what's going on or seeing captions. This is made possible for us. Now, we live in this time where there's this opportunity to include everyone. And yet internationally, there's also this challenge of a divide between the technological haves and have-nots. And here in Ontario, we have this opportunity to help people overcome it. Because you can think of the digital divide in terms of 4 screens. The first screen is like this theater we're in. Everyone gets together and watches some content. The second screen of the 4 screens was the television, and it became traveled like no other technology in the history of the world around the planet, because people were so intrigued with the idea that they could control what they were watching. The third screen was the laptop screen, the computer screen, and a lot of people have true interactions. But the fourth screen, the one where the majority of humanity is going to have their first experience online, is the mobile screen. And it's this mobile screen that 70% of humanity will enjoy the internet for the first time, is where the true opportunity comes to us for accessibility. Because it used to be that, let's say you couldn't see color, and you have to make sure your clothes match in the morning. You can either wear black, or you can have a little device that tells you what color things are. You point at it and it says red, green, yellow. But all these specialized devices are now being replaced by apps. So the cost of instead of having a $200 color device, I can have an app for $4, which turns my cell phone into the same thing. And as each of these technologies becomes possible on a tablet, it means that more and more people can take devices that were intended for the mainstream and repurpose them. So if you want to drive down the road and also be able to speak to your device, you don't need to buy a special device anymore. Someone's created an app for that. So allowing us to paddle hard towards this ideal, to be world leaders where we can reach everyone gets our messages anytime on any device using any browser, well, it's an awesome ideal, and it's almost unreachable. But we can do a better job than anyone's ever done before in doing this. And the way we do it is by following the international standards called WCAG 2. AODA points to these standards, and other speakers today will get into the details, but what you need to know is this WCAG 2 standard, this nerdy sounding standard that the Ontario government has chosen to point AODA at, is the same standard that every government in the world who's thinking about this is going towards. You know, I started off saying I audited sites from 50 countries. Every one of them was either chosen WCAG 2 or was choosing WCAG 2. So if you can get your heads around this, you increase your value to your own career, to your organization. WCAG 2 isn't going anywhere. There's no WCAG 3 in process right now. These principles are good to know, and they're going to be good to know for a long time. So here in Ontario, we've nailed it. We lead the world at this. But the Norwegians and Ontario, we have this interesting relationship because back over 20 years ago, the term sustainability was first coined by someone in Ontario, but the Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, is the one who actually made it famous. And back then, the definition of sustainability was very much about environmentalism. It was just about, rather than just worrying about profit, we're also going to worry about the planet. But a better definition has come up over time called triple bottom line. And triple bottom line includes people. You know, we've been involved with, the last thing I'm going to share with you today is we've been working, it was mentioned that I'm a designer, we've been working with a global organization called EcoGrata, which is like the United Nations of Design. We wanted to create a global standard for sustainability. But we insisted that that include people, not just environmentalism. And so just like there's a LEED standard which says how accessible is this building, you have a point system to decide. The LEED standard is what architects use to measure sustainability. We've been developing a system where you can test your products for accessibility and other aspects. And the global standard then for a design project or a communications project with sustainable measures on environmental aspects, but it also measures on social aspects. And the most important social aspect on the list that gets the points is making sure your product is accessible for people with disabilities. And where did all this thinking come from? Right here in Canada again. So we have so many reasons to be proud of ourselves that right here in this country, we punch above our weight class, right in this province, right in this city, we punch above our weight class globally. And sure, there's great business reasons to get this done, but there's also good reasons for our heart. You know, I'm sure every one of us is touched by disability in some way, whether it's ourselves, a parent, a child, and I'm just thrilled that you've chosen to immerse yourself in this. So I'm opening it up, and we should hand it back to Aidan, I think, and we'll take it forward that please really do embrace this opportunity, not to just do better marketing, but to just do better things in everything you do. Fair enough?
Thank you, David. We'll have questions at the end.
I just wanted to mention, as a representative of the CMA, we're actually revamping our website.
I forgot to mention that. I'm sorry, Kristen. Yeah.
So we'll have questions at the end. Our next speaker will be Brittany Taylor. Brittany is an associate at Davis LLP's Toronto office and is a member of the Employment and Labor Law Group. Brittany has experience advising employers on their current and upcoming obligations under the AODA. That's the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act from 2005. She has assisted employers to draft and implement accessible customer service policies. I'm sure she'll explain what that is. practices, and procedures, as well as multi-year accessibility plans and accessibility policies. Brittany has also helped employers to respond to audit letters from the Accessibility Directorate of Ontario, who is also a co-sponsor of today's event, and to comply with their reporting obligations under the AODA. Brittany's experience also includes working with senior counsel to represent employers in a broad range of employment and labor law matters. So please welcome Brittany Taylor.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So I'm the lawyer of the group. I'm here to talk to you about your legal obligations under the AODA and hopefully help demystify this legislation a little bit here. Oh. Yes, so there's my title slide. Very impressive. Okay, so let's start with the basics. So what is the AODA? So the AODA was passed in 2005, and the goal of the legislation is to create a barrier-free Ontario for persons with disabilities by 2025. So the AODA is a very broad-reaching piece of legislation. It applies to both public and private organizations and to large and small organizations. The AODA itself as a piece of legislation establishes several very important things. So it defines many of the concepts that you're going to see used throughout the AODA and its regulations, including what is a disability, what is a barrier, and what is an accessibility standard. The other thing it does is it gives the government the right to establish enforceable accessibility standards by regulation under the Act and sets out how these standards are going to be developed. And thirdly, it sets out the powers of the government to ensure compliance and enforce the Act, including the power to conduct inspections, to issue orders, and in some cases, administrative penalties. So I'm going to talk more about the enforcement aspect of the AODA towards the end of the presentation because I like to leave the really scary stuff for last. So these things are all really important, but the real meat in terms of your requirements under the AODA are these accessibility standards that I keep mentioning. So the government has created 5 accessibility standards that set out what you have to do in order to comply with the AODA. And as I said, this is done by creating regulations under the Act. So the first standard to be created is the customer service standard. And I'm sure everybody likes to think it's so special that it gets its own regulation, but it's really just because it was the first regulation to be passed under the AODA. So the customer service standard is already in effect. It applies to every public sector organization and every other person or organization that provides goods or services to members of the public or other third parties and that has at least one employee in Ontario. This is an incredibly broad definition, and I think the message is clear that the government is saying the AODA should apply to almost everyone who does business in Ontario, which makes sense. You can't have a barrier-free Ontario by 2025 if only half of the organizations in Ontario are required to comply with the AODA. The customer service standard governs the accessible provision of goods and services to persons with disabilities and includes things like the requirement to establish policies, practices, and procedures governing the provision of goods and services to persons with disabilities, supporting the use of service animals and support persons, having an accessible feedback process, and training employees, agents, volunteers, and other people who interact with the public. Different requirements will apply under the standard depending on whether your organization has 20 or more employees. The compliance deadlines depend on what type of organizations you are. So if you're a public sector organization, your compliance deadline was January 1st, 2010, and for everyone else, January 1st, 2012. The remaining 4 accessibility standards are lumped into an omnibus regulation called the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, which I'm going to refer to from now on as the IASR. So let's unpack the IASR a little bit. It's an intimidating beast of a regulation, but it's stuffed full of important things that you need to know. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 5 accessibility standards under the AODA. We've talked about the customer service standard already. The IASR is going to cover the remaining 4 standards, which are information and communications, employment, transportation, and the design of public spaces. Each standard has its own unique requirements, and each of these requirements has its own unique deadline. So as a result, some of the requirements under the information and communication standard and the employment standard, for example, are already in effect, while other requirements under those exact same standards won't come into effect until 2021. So if that isn't enough, the IASR also creates a series of general requirements. They don't belong to any one particular standard, but they're just as important. So I'm sure some of you are hoping after that description that somehow the ISR will magically not apply to you. But unfortunately, or rather fortunately, I think, the ISR applies to pretty much everyone. So it applies to anyone who provides goods, services, or facilities to the public, or even just to other third parties, and that has at least one employee in Ontario. Like the customer service standard, the IASR makes a distinction between organizations based on size and type. So when thinking about your obligations under the IASR, the first thing you need to figure out is where you fall in that classification system. Organizations are divided generally into public sector organizations, which are specifically designated under the regulation, and private sector organizations. In each of these categories, there are subcategories based on the size of your organization. So organizations with less than 50 employees are considered small organizations, and organizations with 50 or more employees are considered large organizations. What requirements apply to you and when you have to comply entirely depend on how you were classified under the IASR. So that's really important to get a handle on that first. I'm not going to go into much more detail about the general requirements of the ISR at this time because we're focusing largely today on digital accessibility. However, please feel free to speak with me after the seminar. I'm also just going to throw out a plug here for my firm. On October 28th, 2014, we're holding a free seminar on the AODA and developing your compliance strategy, including tackling your obligations under the ISR. I'm sure it will be very helpful if it's keeping you up at night. So if you're interested, please feel free to ask me about that. Okay, so let's move on to talk specifically about digital accessibility requirements. People are getting really freaked out about the digital accessibility requirements now, largely because as of January 1st, 2014, the requirement to have an accessible website or web content requirements under the Information and Communication Standard became a real thing that people had to start worrying about. But the truth is that digital accessibility is all over the AODA. There are several requirements under both the Customer Service Standard and the IASR that requires organizations to post things on their website or even just to distribute information to the general public at large. So I've listed the ones that come to mind for me immediately under the Customer Service Standard and the ISR. I mentioned earlier when talking about the Customer Service Standard that it requires organizations to develop policies, practices, and procedures that govern the provision of its goods or services to persons with disabilities. These policies have to be consistent with 3 key principles, and the third of these principles is that persons with disabilities must be given an opportunity equal to that given to others to obtain, use, and benefit from the goods or services. So, as David said, websites are becoming more and more important in terms of the provision of goods and services today. In a lot of cases, people have the ability to search for and buy products online, and that's only going to become more common as we go forward. In order for a person with a disability to have an equal opportunity to obtain, use, and benefit from your products, you may have already started to think about making your website more accessible long before this website requirement under the Information and Communication Standard actually came out. Certainly, I think this third requirement is designed to get organizations thinking about what changes they can make throughout the organization to comply with the overall message of equal opportunity, and that includes digital accessibility. Under Section 5 of the Customer Service Standard, if organizations make certain facilities or services available to persons with disabilities, such as having a sign language interpreter on site, and there's an interruption in those services, for instance, the interpreter calls in sick that day, the organization has to give notice of the disruption to the public. So what's the easiest way to get information out to the most amount of people in the fastest way possible? Digitally. So even though it doesn't actually say that in the regulation, that's the reality of what that requirement will often have organizations doing. Digital accessibility considerations also crop up when we are talking about the creation of an accessible feedback process under either the Customer Service Standard or the IASR. In many cases, nowadays, feedback is received either via a company's website directly or through email. Organizations with more than 20 employees are required to notify customers that the documents they are required to create under the Customer Service Standard are available upon request. So most of my clients have actually just posted those policies online to make them available, or posted a statement making it clear that these documents are available. Under the IASR, there are many sections which require an organization to notify the public in the same way, either about the availability of documents, about the existence of an accessible feedback process, or about the availability of accommodation for persons with disabilities, especially when we're talking about the employment standard. Organizations with 50 or more employees under the ISR are required to post their multi-year accessibility plan on their website. So there's no bones about this one. It says specifically right in the regulation, you have to post this on your website. So again, the AODA is concerned with digital accessibility in that aspect. Let's talk specifically for a moment about the accessible websites and web content requirement under the ISR. You can find these in section 14 of the ISR in case you want some light reading later. The requirement states that public sector organizations, both large and small, and large private organizations shall make their websites and web content conform to the World Wide Web Consortium Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG 2.0. So if you're like me, you're sitting there saying to yourself, what the heck is a WCAG? It sounds terrifying, and quite frankly, it sounds expensive. But it's actually not that scary. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, is simply an internationally accepted standard for web accessibility. It's the second version of these guidelines, which is where the 2.0 comes out. They are simply guidelines for creating an accessible website. It gives you success criteria that you can meet in order to make your website more accessible. I'm not going to talk too much about what those guidelines are because my colleagues have and will continue to do a much better and more practical job of doing that. But I can tell you that the guidelines are developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, which is basically just an international team of IT nerds. No, I'm just kidding. This is an international team of highly trained experts. So there are 3 levels of accessibility under the WCAG guidelines that you need to worry about. The level A, level AA, and level AAA. Level AAA is the highest level of accessibility. The AODA only ever requires compliance up to the second level, level AA. Let's talk about deadlines. The deadlines have caused some confusion and, let's be honest, panic among a lot of people, and that's because there's 2 of them. January 1st, 2014, which is already passed, and January 1st, 2021. If you have a new internet website as of January 1st, 2014, then you must conform with WCAG 2.0 Level A by the end of this year. Now, I say by the end of this year because even though technically you should already be in compliance, you don't actually have to report on this to the government until December 31st, 2014. So there is that little bit of wiggle room if you're still getting this process set up if you have to. If you have managed to avoid the first deadline of January 1st, 2014, don't worry, your time will come. All internet websites and web content published after January 1st, 2012 will be required to comply with WCAG Level AA by January 1st, 2021, just with the 2 exceptions noted on the slide. So what is a new website? The Accessibility Directorate has thankfully provided us with some helpful clarification in this regard. A new website is a website with a new domain name, such as AODArules.com, becoming AODAisawesome.com. It also includes a website that is undergoing a significant refresh. So what does this mean? This means changing more than 50% of the content, design, or technology of the site. So if you're rewriting or reorganizing graphics, text, changing the layout of your website, changing how you navigate through the website, changing the style, the publishing platform, and so on, you're going to want to think about whether you have changed your website enough to fall into the significant refresh category. Now keep in mind that the requirements under Section 14 of the ISR only apply to web content dating back to January 1st, 2012. So if you are a digital hoarder and you have documents that are long outdated posted on your website, you don't need to worry about those. It's only content posted after January 1st, 2012. So 2021, that seems really far away. Why should you care about these web accessibility requirements now? Well, for one thing, the deadline is going to creep up on you. It always does. If you can make small changes to your website every year, it will reduce the amount of work and the amount of stress that you have to go through come January 1st, 2021. It may also reduce the amount of requests that you get from customers for documents and information to be provided in an accessible format. So it may have an additional advantage for you there. And it can also just be a good business decision. David did a really good job of going through all the reasons to comply sooner rather than later. Oh. I seem to be missing some of my slides. That's okay. I really only had one left on enforcement, and I'll just tell you what it is. It's the scary stuff. You probably don't want to see the slide anyway. It's horrifying. So what happens if you fail to comply? What can the government do to you? The first step is actually asking nicely. They're pretty good about that. If you fail to file your accessibility report or you contravene an accessibility standard, heaven forbid, you can be ordered to file your report or to comply with the accessibility standard within a certain time period. So that's the first step. The second step gets a little scarier. They can slap you with an administrative penalty. The amount of the administrative penalty depends on several things. So one is whether the fine is being imposed on a corporation or individual. Two is the severity of the impact of the contravention. So whether the contravention is minor, moderate, or major. And the third thing is the contravention history of the person or organization over the last 2 reporting cycles. Fines can range from $250 to $2,000 for individuals and from $500 to $15,000 for corporations. Now here's something else really scary. If you are a major AODA baddie and you have committed a serious contravention and have just a shameful contravention history, the penalty can be treated as a daily penalty, up to a maximum of $100,000 in the case of a corporation and $50,000 in the case of an individual. And it gets worse. You can also be convicted of an offense under the AODA where you provide false or misleading information in an accessibility report, fail to comply with an order under the AODA, obstruct an inspector under the AODA, or intimidate, coerce, penalize, or discriminate another person who seeks to enforce their rights under the Act. If you are convicted of an offense under the AODA, the fines are substantial. Individuals can be fined up to $50,000 per day as long as the offense continues to occur. Corporations, that amount is $100,000 per day. And something that you need to know as a director or officer of a corporation is that you can be individually liable for the $50,000 daily fine where you fail to take all reasonable care to prevent the corporation from committing an offense under the AODA. So that's scary stuff. So I think the message is clear. Take the AODA seriously, take your obligations seriously, and not just because the penalties are scary, but as David said, because it's the right thing to do. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it back to Aidan to introduce our last speaker.
Thank you, Brittany. So So our third and final speaker before the panel discussion is George Zamfir, sitting up here. George is an accessibility specialist at Facebook. He currently leads accessibility testing across Facebook's products and platforms, keeping an eye on scaling and web and mobile accessibility throughout the company. You can find more about that at facebook.com/accessibility. Prior to joining Facebook, George led the technical solutioning at Scotiabank, and he's at Good Wally. George helps select clients to strategize and build accessibility into their web products. George is passionate about bringing the accessibility community together. He's an organizer of the annual Toronto Accessibility Camp, which is actually happening this coming weekend in Toronto. And he's the founder and co-organizer of the Toronto Accessibility and Inclusive Design Group meetup. And I'm also a member of that, and I highly recommend, if you're interested, it's a really wonderful thing that George and a few others in the community have created. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce George.
Thank you. Thanks, Aidan. I'm the special one. I need to have my own laptop. I'm so happy that Brittany did all this caring, because I usually do that at other conferences or other presentations, and I'm not even a lawyer. But in my presentation, I'm hoping that I'll give you some practical advice to meeting the AODA, and especially to making your websites accessible. Things that I find myself going back to, whether I'm working with clients in different industries or at Facebook or in other places. So here it is. I do a bunch of things. I'm happy that we mentioned the meetup and the camp. These are things that are grassroots in Toronto. There are accessibility meetups all over the world, especially many of them in US and Australia, a few in Europe, even in Tokyo, Japan. And ours is by far the largest. And Toronto is really considered a hub for inclusive design and accessibility. We have the OCAD University Inclusive Design Master's Program and all other things. So really, if you need help with it, there are communities out there for you. I do a bunch of other things, and the reason I can do all this stuff, I thought, is because I drink lots of coffee. I have mine with me here. But it turns out I'm coffee impaired. David talked about not just the traditional disabilities, and I don't want to downplay traditional disabilities because I have one, but the accessibility market is much larger than just the traditional critical disabilities, wheelchair symbols, and so on, right? So I'm coffee impaired. I took a genetic test, and it turns out that I can drink as much coffee as I want, and I can sleep like a baby, because I don't process caffeine in a way that keeps me awake. If anything, puts me to sleep. That's my son falling asleep on his butt. He definitely got my genes. But consider this. I go in a coffee shop and to get a coffee, and the owner says, sorry, we're not going to sell you any coffee because it doesn't work on you, right? We're going to waste our fair trade, organic, hand-brewed, oven-roasted, magical, amazing coffee on you, so we're not going to sell it. Sounds ridiculous. Except that's exactly what we do sometimes on the web. This is derived from a real-world conversation with a client, an ex-client. I fired them. Blind people don't buy cameras, so we didn't make our shopping cart accessible. Because blind people can't see photos, so they won't take photos, so we're not going to bother with that. And that is similar to my coffee impairment. Keep that in mind. Because we're curious in nature, we actually ran a study at Facebook to see how people who are visually impaired use Facebook. And it turns out that they have as many friends as the average, they upload almost as many pictures as the average, and they actually post more than the average. So that whole theory is blown out of the water. My point is that we sometimes make assumptions that we're not even fully aware of. And as marketing professionals, you may leave behind an audience. You're missing on some of your audience. And normally I would spend much more time talking about all the different reasons to do accessibility, but I don't have to, because now we have the AODA. And I would love it if within your companies and organizations you would do it because for the right reasons. It's your company culture, you see the benefits of it, so on and so forth. But if you're doing it because it's the law, I'm totally okay with that too. I'm hoping not, though. Also, WCAG is something that I could spend at least a day on, and to give you some coding advice, design advice, project management on how to do accessibility, and also meet WCAG. But instead, what I decided to do is compile a list of what I call the top 5 tips for building accessible products. And again, these are kind of things that I go back to, whether in my day job, working with other clients, small, big, the kind of general guidelines that I see. The first one is that accessibility gets done differently in different places. That is to say, there isn't one model that you can apply to all places. And I'm going to talk about 2 models, the Facebook one and the Scotiabank model. And of course, these are not models just specific to these 2 organizations. The Scotiabank model can be found with other financial companies, with other companies as that size. The same with Facebook. So I call them the all stars have to align model, and done is better than perfect. So for example, the Scotiabank, we had, I haven't been with Scotiabank for about a year, so this may have changed, okay? Don't hold me liable to all of this. But we normally have 3 to 4 months release cycles, let's say for the online banking site, or any major releases for the .com site. We would have, in order to get any accessibility in a release, we would have to get buy-in from the business. We had to get developers and QA resources and designers. We had to usually get some training done because there isn't a lot of accessibility knowledge. We had to, you would also need, most likely you would also need some sort of accessibility specialist or an accessibility team to be able to coordinate all this, to write a testing strategy, to write some requirements that a business can put in, and so on and so forth. So all these stars would have to align very early on in order to get any accessibility work even started. It may sound like a bad thing, but it's not, because with planning, this would make it very easy and a breeze for everyone. The Facebook model is, as you probably can imagine, a little more agile, but also a little more blurry. So our release cycles are 1 to 2 weeks, whether it's the website, mobile apps, what have you. Done is better than perfect is to say that we'd rather ship a product or release a website or launch a product as soon as possible, and then iterate on it, improve it on a regular basis to make it perfect. But we wouldn't wait that 3-4 months to make it perfect and then release. Also, the accessibility work is very distributed. In the last quarter, over 80 developers worked on accessibility tasks. And we define a task as a bug, a new feature, or an improvement. So not just bug fixes, but anything around accessibility. Most of them did not have any accessibility experience. We didn't have a center of excellence, a team, accessibility team to train everybody else, to plan for everybody else. It was very distributed. The accessibility team at Facebook, by the way, is 3 people, myself included. So we couldn't possibly do that. So the idea is that it's scaled. Also, the accessibility work is very asynchronous. It doesn't follow this waterfall model. It's not that we make design accessible and then we move to development and that is done and then we do QA. It is happening all at once. And I won't go into the details of how that magic is happening because it's beyond the topic of this presentation, but it does. The myth that I'm seeing out there the most is that when accessibility doesn't get done is because developers don't want to do it. And you can replace your developers with designers, testers, or they don't want to do it, or they don't like it. It is absolutely not true. I've never met a web professional who said, I don't want to do this, I don't like this, I don't like my blind aunt. It doesn't make any sense. If accessibility doesn't get done, it's usually a business or organizational problem. I'm speaking at other conferences to people who are new to accessibility, which is great because I'm done speaking to the converted. And they almost always, I see nods. People are nodding, they're saying, oh yeah, I have this challenge, right? It's not the developers, it's accessibility. It's usually we never got requirements, or developers have some competing priorities, all these things. And I'll go through a few of those in a second. The second tip or piece of advice I have for you is to make accessibility everyone's job. Most likely your web project looks something like this. There's some sort of analysis, planning phase, there's some information architecture, graphic design development, so on and so forth. And at every stage, you have some accessibility work that you need to do. For example, in that analysis planning stage, if the release doesn't have accessibility requirements in, it's not going to just magically happen. That is something that you don't do when you get to the development stage, you do it early. Graphic designers have to worry about color contrast. Stop using dark gray text on light gray backgrounds. Right? I always hear this from designers. We want content to be there, but not really there, because we don't want it to detract from the main content. So put it there, but make the contrast so low that people don't notice it. Maybe you shouldn't put it there. Footers are usually a problem, right? You have some information in the footer, and you want it to be there, but not there. Notice I didn't even get to development. All right? You have to do all these things before you get to development. What usually happens, or used to happen, is that we would get to 2 weeks before we launch the website, and we're doing some QA, and somebody says, can you please test this just to make sure we're good for accessibility? We are not. I've seen this happening many times. We are not. When accessibility is something nebulous that kind of floats around, but designers don't really do it because they don't feel like they own it. Developers don't really do it because they never got requirements. Everybody has their very perfectly valid reason not to do it. But in QA, we realized that we had to do it. So this is happening a lot. So what do you do? So let's say you're in this scenario. You have 2 weeks until you launch the website. And you have some bugs reported. You need to fix accessibility. And now everybody's freaking out because we have some bugs that the color contrast is not sufficient. The alternative text for images is not there. Keyboard navigation doesn't work. Screen reader support. We have all these issues. And they're being assigned to developers. And developers hate it because it is not their job to fix colors. It is not their job to fix alternative text. That is a content strategy matter. And they get frustrated. And then this misconception. Accessibility is really, really hard. It is not hard. It's the situation that we put ourselves in that makes accessibility hard. If we made our technology stack decisions 5 months ago, we're going to use this JavaScript library, and we're going to use this technology, and so on and so forth, and we're going to build a website. If we decided on all that 5 months ago, and 2 weeks before we launch, we realized that our navigation menus are not accessible by keyboard. If I'm blind, I can't use a mouse, I have to do it by keyboard. If that doesn't work, it makes it really hard to go back 5 months ago and fix that library, or completely change your technology choices, right? The same with colors. We decided on our branding colors 5 months ago, and now this accessibility goofball comes in and says you have to change the colors because if you don't have 20/20 vision, you can't see colors. That is a big problem, right? And it's also very hard, but it's not accessibility that is hard. It's the situation that we put ourselves in that makes accessibility hard. But if you are in this situation, I would suggest you start with high impact, low wins, or low fixes. This is obviously very distracting. So if you have to prioritize, you have to be smart about it. If you are in that 2 weeks stage and you don't know what to do, choose the stuff that has high impact and they're fairly easy to fix. Right? I know everybody is kind of running around and scrambling and doing all this stuff, but you have to sit down a little bit and find what's really important. So I'll give you an example. Everybody hates online forms. Designers hate it because they can't really style it that much. Developers hate it because it's basically boring. You have a library now that can do a form for you. But this is what we use to capture that very precious customer information. And if these forms are not accessible, then all of a sudden you're saying to your customers, we don't want your information, right? That is very high impact. That's how you get your information, your data. Another example is navigation menus. It's very high impact because you have it on all pages. And if it's fairly simple to fix, this makes it the holy grail. You fix it once and it applies everywhere, right? And there are other examples. The mistake that I'm seeing the most is that people start doing the hardest thing ever. Their heart is in the right place because they start with the hardest thing. But usually that has the potential to, it starts, or work on it starts very slowly, and it has the potential to get stopped in its tracks. Or people start with very low impact things that are not really that important. Or both. They start with the stuff that is really hard to do that nobody cares about. So don't start with that. It's not a good idea. Also, you can't show any you can't show any progress for your work if you're working 1 month on something that is not getting better, right? So this is also for your own interest. The number 4 tip or advice that I have is setting expectations and being realistic. So I worked with a client who hired a web agency who was supposed to deliver a website that was also supposed to be accessible. And I asked them, what's your accessibility knowledge can you deliver? And they said, oh yeah, we can do it. We can do it WCAG 2 quadruple A compliant. That doesn't exist, by the way, just to make it clear. And Section 508, okay, that's in the US, we don't really care. And all these things. So you need to be really aware of what your requirements are and make sure you set the right expectations. Also, as an organization, if you work whether with your internal team or an external web team, if you say something like this, we need our website to be accessible, that's not a requirement, that's a wish. It's very different, it's not documented. So you have to be specific. I don't want WCAG 2 level A, I don't want triple A, I want double A. And I want it by this date, and you have to be clear. If you're not sure what you need, ask for help. Of course, the mistake that I'm seeing is we'll just do it in phase 2. Accessibility is kind of nebulous, nobody did it, we're close to launch date. The website launches, and we say, well, we never did it, so let's do it in phase 2. Phase 2 never happens. Never, ever happens. And if it happens, it's completely different, looks completely different than what we thought it would be. That's because people moved from one company to another, one group to another. All of a sudden, we have scope creep. Our phase 2 is much bigger than we thought it is. So it never happens. So your best bet is ABC, always be closing. If the project is launched, if the website is done, accessibility should be done. I put myself in a very bad situation with a client. There was still some accessibility work needed to be done, but the website was launched. Everybody was out partying because it was a success. And I was patting everybody. I was like, so can you please do that accessibility stuff? Like, we still have to do this. When do you think you can go away, we're drinking? Right? You don't want to put yourself in that situation. You want to be done with it, even if it's not good or perfect. You don't want it to be lingering. And the final advice that I have for you is don't be afraid to piggyback on other initiatives. David mentioned search engine optimization. At Scotiabank, oops. Ooh, out of sync. So at Scotiabank, I work very closely with the digital marketing team. I started working with them on redesigning the scotiabank.com website, and I thought that was it. That was one project. I ended up working with them on 10, if not 15 other projects. One of them was a search engine optimization initiative. How in the world do you piggyback that to do accessibility? It turns out both SEO and accessibility have some common goals. Like, we want high quality content to be discovered by both search engines and people with disabilities. That's a common goal. And everybody loved it because the business line or the digital marketing team got two things for one. They got accessibility and SEO. And the developers loved it because they didn't get two sets of requirements. They got only one. And it makes sense. So don't be afraid to piggyback on those. And also redesigns are a great opportunity because everybody wants to start fresh. We have a new website. People leave behind most of the time their biases and politics and stuff like that. So that's a great time to do accessibility. I saw somebody cringing there. No politics go with you all the way? So there you have it. 5 tips for practical web accessibility. And I'm hoping this was as useful. This is as useful to you as it was fun for me to do, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Just to wrap up, thank you. It was an extremely informative and persuasive session, I think, for marketers. We do a lot of things to improve our reach to consumers, and I think what we've heard today is a very compelling case for building accessibility into what we do as marketers. It makes good business sense. It's smart business for us as well as the right thing to do. And so I think that's what we've heard. A tremendous panel here this morning. I want to thank Aidan, David, George and Brittany for a very, very informative session. I've got a token of thanks from the Canadian Marketing Association, and I want to thank all of you for joining us here this morning. We will be having more information on accessibility, a webinar later this fall, a session at our Digital Crossroads conference on November the 24th, and other opportunities over the coming year. So once again, join me in thanking our panel, and have a great day.